I don't have to admit anybody, right? I can see that I could, but it's not up to me, right? There's somebody waiting in the waiting room.
Yeah. That's Grzegorzy's task. Yes, thank you. Oh, but if you'd like to.
No,
don't worry.
No, thank you.
You have another responsibility today. We just wait one more minute, I guess, because people are still coming in. So we wait one more minute for more people to arrive, and then we're going to start. Briefly by an introduction. Hello, good afternoon, good day, good morning, wherever you are, whichever time zone. It's a great pleasure to today's lecture by Professor Antonella Sorace. On behalf of my co-convener, Anna Ewert, I would like to welcome you to the 4th lecture of this series. And this is a series of invited lecture in bilingualism and multilingualism. The series is organized jointly by the Institute for Advanced Studies in Social Studies and Humanities, by the Faculty of English at Adam Mickiewicz University, and the Poznań branch of Bilingualism Matters. Together with my colleague Anna, we have convened a series of 8 open lectures by outstanding researchers, distinguished scholars, and world experts in the field of bilingualism and multilingualism. And the series consists of 8 lectures. We're halfway through today, it seems, each by a different invited speaker, and they are taking October till June 2022. And they are always delivered via the Zoom platform and they are live streamed on the Facebook of the Faculty of English, as well as Bilingualism Matters. And today it's our great honor and privilege to welcome Professor Antonella Sorace from the University of Edinburgh, our distinguished scholar and our friend and colleague, who delivered the lecture on reassessing gradient variation in models on grammar and bilingualism. And I would like now to pass over to Professor Anna Ewert to introduce our speaker for today.
Our guest today, Antonella Sorace, is Professor of Developmental Linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. She's a Fellow of the British Academy and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on a number of interrelated questions that bring together linguistics, experimental psychology, and cognitive science. And her research achievements and publications span different subfields of scientific inquiry. She's a world-leading authority on bilingualism over the lifespan, and is particularly well known for her studies of exceptionally talented adult second language speakers, language attrition and bilingual language acquisition, language typology, and the lexicon syntax interface. She is the founding director of the Bilingualism Matters International Network, which at the moment has almost 30 branches across the world, spanning 3 continents. Antonella Sorace was also awarded a Beltane Fellowship for Public Engagement, and she is also our partner in the TEAM project, which co-finances today's lecture, and you're bound to hear more about the TEAM project pretty soon. So this is time to begin the lecture. If you have questions, you can either type them in the chat during the presentation or ask them in person after the lecture. So this is over to you now, Antonella.
Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you, even if it's not with you in person, it's online. We all have to deal with this. And we hope that the time will come back soon to interact in the same spaces and see each other's faces, you know, just close by. But for now, I'm really happy to be with you and to exchange some ideas about what I'm going to present. What I'm going to present is not something that is cast in stone. I want to emphasize that many of the issues that I'm going to raise are questions in progress, research in progress. And so I'd be delighted to hear your comments and suggestions and criticisms, if you have any, about what I'm going to say. You see, I'm going to, sorry, I think, yes, when I scroll, typically it doesn't scroll to the next one. It may, sometimes it scrolls to the following one. I'm going to talk about gradient interfaces. This is part of the title. So what are they? And I'd like to refer to a quote by Colin Phillips and colleagues that refers to complex contingencies. And what they mean by complex contingencies are language phenomena that involve the integration of information across multiple levels of encoding. So this is what, you know, a first approximation of what I mean by interface or interfacing structures. And my point is going to be that these interfacing structures are more variable in both monolingual speakers and bilingual speakers. And we'll see that they're more variable in both second language learners, but also in first language attrition. So in fact, what I'm going to show is an emerging convergence between second language learning and changes in the L1, particularly for these language structures that interface with particular domains. So the convergence, the variation that we see tends to converge for these two populations. I'm going to talk about two populations, second language learners on the one hand, and first language attriters, if we want to use this term, on the other hand. And we'll see that the variation that we see tends to be in the same areas. So that's what I mean by convergence. And I'm going to show that it is active convergence. So we tend to find convergence for these particular structures. And ultimately, this is one of the open research questions that we are addressing at the moment. We are asking ourselves if there is this convergence that we see has a functional value. So attrition on the one hand, or changes in the first language, as I prefer to call them, and second language acquisition are two sides of the same coin, and in some respects, they may actually go together in the sense that this is the hypothesis that we are exploring, and I'll come back to this at the end of my presentation, whether some selective changes in the first language may be functionally related to good levels of attainment in the second language. In other words, two sides of the same coin. I'm going to actually show evidence of this kind of convergence, and what I mean by gradient interfaces from two areas of my research. I tend to work more in the second one, not in the first one that I'm about to present. But I'm trying to pull it in, partly because I like the feeling of feeling, like a single person rather than different people, working on very different aspects of language and language learning. So I'm myself, exploring connections between what I found and what other people have found with respect to split intransitivity, and what I and other people have found with respect to referential subjects, which is the second area that I'm going to talk about. So for split intransitivity, this is what we can call the lexicon syntax interface. We know from the literature that there are two sides of split intransitivity. One is a syntactic side. So there is a configurational difference, if you like, between unaccusative verbs and unergative verbs with respect to the status of their subject. So we're talking about intransitive verbs divided into two syntactic categories. But what I'm particularly interested in is the interface side. So these are aspectual lexical semantic features of verbs that actually modulate, interact with the distribution of verbs in these two classes. And so they create different degrees of variation, different degrees of dependence on contextual variables. And this is, one of the unifying points of my own research. So yes, we learn a lot from linguistic theory, but at the same time, we can discover how language interacts with non-linguistic variables, with contextual variables, and we can understand orderly variation better. So it's not random variation, as we'll see, but it's actually predictable variation that we can explore and to some extent predict. So the starting point of split intransitivity, as I said, the famous unaccusative hypothesis that goes back quite a long time, and that in linguistics distinguishes between the single argument of unaccusative verbs, which is not really a subject, but it's an underlying direct object that appears in subject position, but syntactically is an underlying direct object, as opposed to the single argument of unergative verbs, which is actually a subject at all levels of representation. So this is, if you want, a dichotomous, a categorical distinction between two types of intransitive verbs. Now, what my own research has found, and other people's research as well, is that actually there is variation, but the variation is not random. So there is orderly variation that can be represented as a hierarchy. So we can call it the split intransitivity hierarchy, just to give it a name. But basically, depending on the lexical semantics and the aspectual features of these particular verbs, a verb tends to be more categorically unaccusative in its behavior or more categorically unergative in its behavior. So that hierarchy shows that change of location verbs, for example, semantically change of location verbs, tend to have more categorical unaccusative behavior, in whichever way you want to define it. And the syntactic manifestations of unaccusativity, of split intransitivity, vary from language to language. They tend to be similar in typologically similar languages, but they're also different depending on the languages. On the opposite side of the hierarchy, verbs denoting an agentive activity, so verbs denoting processes, first of all, rather than telic actions. So verbs denoting agentive activities tend to be categorically unergative. The verbs in the middle are more variable, and they're variable in an orderly way. So stative verbs tend to be more variable, both within individual languages, but also across languages. So it's a funny hierarchy because it doesn't go from most to least, but it has more variability in the middle. Now, I've explored this hierarchy in particular for a very evident manifestation of split intransitivity in a language like Italian, or in other languages that have a choice of perfective auxiliaries in compound tenses. So Italian has the choice of auxiliary between be and have, essere and avere in Italian. And and again, other people as well, have found that there is an auxiliary selection hierarchy that basically is an instantiation of what I've just mentioned. So change or location verbs are the most categorical in selecting be as an auxiliary, essere in Italian. Verbs of controlled, non-motional controlled processes at the opposite side of the hierarchy are the ones that tend to be more categorical in selecting have. And in the middle, you find increasing variation towards the center of the hierarchy. This is there are data that prove this, and the primary dimension seems to be agentivity. Telicity, rather, the primary semantic dimension, if you want. The secondary dimension that affects non-telic verbs tends to be agentivity. So among the atelic verbs, the most agentive ones tend to have more categorically, and the least agentive ones tend to alternate between have and be. So there are there's plenty of evidence that I'm coming back to in a minute. So this is a challenge for a purely linguistic model of the lexicon syntax interface, because it's clear that some verbs can appear only in one syntactic configuration, but others can appear in both, but to different degrees. So it's orderly, systematic variation. And so we have a system that is both rigid on one hand, categorical if you want, but flexible on the other. And so our challenge, it's certainly what I regard as a challenge for an experimental linguist like myself, is to find the connection between rigidity and flexibility. Why do we see this? Now, there is cross-linguistic influence for the split intransitivity hierarchy. Again, auxiliary selection is not the only manifestation of split intransitivity, and there are languages that don't have auxiliary selection anymore, used to have auxiliary selection. For example, Spanish used to have, a productive choice of auxiliary, similar to what we see in modern Italian, but it's lost it diachronically. French is on the way out. French used to have a much more productive choice of auxiliaries in perfective tenses, and now it's only, according to some people, 22 verbs in total that still take être, be in French. So it's clearly moving out of having a productive choice of auxiliaries. But this gradients, this hierarchical style gradients, has been found in a variety of typologically diverse languages, and those are some of the languages are mentioned there. Now, what we are interested in is developmental evidence, right? Because this is what the focus of today's talk. So for acquisition, so for second language acquisition, for example, it has been found, I have plenty of data, that non-native acquisition of Italian, their development of auxiliaries tends to start from core verbs along the hierarchy, and it may never include non-core verbs. So many learners tend to overgeneralize avere, have, for non-core verbs. But the core verbs are definitely the ones that tend to be acquired initially first, and also they tend to be the most stable, in acquisition. In attrition, it seems that, for example, this has been found by Montrul for Spanish native speakers under attrition. And again, remember that Spanish doesn't have a productive choice of auxiliary, but it has other reflexes of unaccusativity and split intransitivity. So postverbal subjects, absolutive constructions, and others. And it seems that in attrition, native speakers maintain a robust knowledge of the syntactic reflexes of unaccusativities with core verbs, but they lose sensitivity to the gradient distinctions along the split intransitivity hierarchy. So the non-core verbs are the most vulnerable, more immediately vulnerable to changes in attrition, whereas the core verbs remain. And it's not just a matter of frequency, in case you're wondering, are the core verbs the most, because that would be an obvious, not an explanation, but, a factor that needs to be considered. So it's not just a matter of frequency. So there are convergences that I mentioned before between attriters and second language learners. So both attrited first language native speakers of Italian and native speakers of Spanish, and advanced non-native speakers of Italian and non-native speakers of Spanish tend to have consistent knowledge of syntactic reflexes of unaccusativity with core verbs, but show either emerging residual optionality with non-core verbs, or a permanent, if you want, residual optionality with non-core verbs, and again, a tendency to overgeneralize have or other syntactic markers of anergativity. So we see the presence of the hierarchy and the presence of variation, increasing variation in both acquisition and attrition. So that's the kind of convergence, an example of convergence. There is diachronic evidence that there seems to be a pan-romance shift from be to have. I've already mentioned Spanish, where it's completed, French, where it's actually very advanced. And the change seems to start from intermediate verbs. Core verbs tend to be affected last in diachronic terms. And there is, again, plenty of evidence in that respect. Now, it's interesting that we've done research on non-Romance languages that have a choice of auxiliary. For example, German, that has a choice of auxiliary, sein and haben, as we know. And there are different kinds of telic verbs in German, some of which, change of location verbs, categorically, almost categorically select sein, as we expect. At the opposite extreme, continuation of process verbs almost categorically select haben, as we also predict on the basis of the hierarchy. And in the middle, you find different kinds of change of state verbs. You find prefixed change of state verbs that tend to go in the direction of sein quite substantially, and unprefixed change of state verbs that are really variable. They go in both directions, and there doesn't seem to be. So the difference between hosten and verhosten, and I'll stop mispronouncing German here for not to hurt your ears. But basically, those are the most variable verbs. We collected data in a study. We collected neurological data, ERP data, and we found that with core haben and sein verbs, auxiliary selection elicits a biphasic N400 P600 waveform, complex waveform, whereas for unprefixed change of state verbs, there is no such a waveform. There is no difference between haben and sein with unprefixed change of state verbs. they really, there's no evidence of a distinction even at the neurological level. However, we also collected up acceptability judgments from the same people whose brain we tested, and we found that acceptability ratings for have, with these verbs correlate with the amplitudes of N400 and P600 waves. So there are larger ERP amplitudes in the haben condition. So if people like these variable verbs with have, that means with the unprefixed change of state verbs, if they like it with haben, then there is a larger ERP amplitude. So there is a commitment to interpreting those verbs in one way rather than the other. And that shows in neurological terms. For us, that's assignment of enrichment, as we call it in that verb, and aspectual coercion. So an enrichment process of interpretation or aspectual coercion is necessary in order for this change of state verbs to be interpreted as process rather than telic change, and therefore more acceptable with haben, with have. And if this process of enrichment is successful, as shown by acceptability judgments, then the acceptability is clearly higher and there is a more pronounced positivity. But this is an example of how, these verbs really can go in different directions, and depending on how we measure the variation and the analysis that we do, we can find different results. So this means that, for auxiliary selection, what speakers have to be able to do is rapidly integrate information from the aspectual sentential context. So go in the way of one interpretation rather than the other. And, they can be, but that commitment, means selecting one auxiliary and inhibiting the other and excluding the other. So this is something that, we'll probably come back to at the end of my talk. So aspectual coercion is a kind of, interpretation that requires integration of information and then subsequently selecting one auxiliary, inhibiting the other. Now, for subject pronouns, and I've seen some names among of you in the audience. I'm sure you've heard this before. We've done a lot of work on the use of subject pronouns in bilingual speakers, and bilingual speakers of null subject languages, again, like Italian or many other languages that allow the choice between a null subject pronoun and an overt subject pronoun. And what we find is a convergence between advanced second language speakers of null subject languages like Italian and Greek and Spanish. We haven't done research on different kinds of null subject languages, like Chinese, for example, and we can come back to this. And native speakers of Italian and Greek and Spanish experiencing attrition in their native language. So we find a convergence among these two populations, also early bilingual children, but I'm leaving early bilingual children aside for the time being. They both overextend the overt pronoun to context in which a null pronoun would be appropriate, but not vice versa. So there seems to be an overgeneralization of the overt form over the null form, but not vice versa. So what we don't see is random variation. We see systematic variation that implies an asymmetric extension of one of the forms over the other, but not vice versa. To illustrate what I mean, let's say take monolingual Italians, and I'll come back to the use of the term monolingual, but I'm using it myself for the sake of simplicity. So later I'll say that, I don't like this, but I'm guilty. I'm as guilty as everybody else. So monolingual Italians, if they see a sentence like this, Carla greeted her daughter when she went out with an overt pronoun. The preferred interpretation is the interpretation where the overt pronoun refers to the non-subject antecedent. So in that sentence, there are two possible antecedents, both plausible, both equal in terms of gender and number, and they are plausible in context. So who went out? Is it Carla or her daughter? The preferred interpretation is that the overt pronoun refers to the non-subject. I mean preferred interpretation because we are not in the domain of categorical choices here. We are not in the domain of ungrammaticality versus grammaticality. We're in the domain of either strong or weaker preferences. Sorry, there's another one that should be there, but it's not, doesn't appear. Okay, for the overt pronoun, what I wanted to show, but it doesn't appear for some reason, when the pronoun is null, so the same sentence with a null subject pronoun, the preferred interpretation is that the null refers to the subject antecedent. So Carla in this case, that would be Carla ha salutato sua figlia quando è uscita. Carla greeted her daughter when null went out. And so there is a division of labor there in terms of preferences between the null tending to refer to the subject antecedent, the overt tending to refer to the non-subject antecedent. Now for bilinguals, for the null, for the overt pronoun, what we see is more variation in the sense that the bilinguals accept and go for the interpretation where the overt refers to the non-subject, but they also go and accept the interpretation where the overt refers to the subject. So there is variation in terms of the interpretation of the overt pronoun. We don't find the variation with respect to the interpretation of the null. So for the null pronoun, both bilinguals and monolinguals go for the subject antecedent as the antecedent of the null pronoun. So we see an asymmetry, as I said before. Now we did some research on pronominal forms in German as well. So German is not a null subject language, but it allows a choice of overt pronominal forms, the personal pronoun and the demonstrative pronoun. And so if we look at these sentences, there is a division of labor that is not dissimilar from the division of labor for pronominal subject forms, null and overt in null subject languages. So that sentence, the waiter greets the cashier. He, the first sentence with the personal pronoun is apparently very nice, as opposed to the second sentence with the demonstrative pronoun there. And the division of labor is that the personal pronoun tends to refer to the subject antecedent, whereas the demonstrative pronoun tends to refer to the non-subject antecedent. And that's what I meant by a similar division of labor. Now, what has been found in research is that in bilingual speakers of German, again, both advanced second language speakers of German and native speakers of German under attrition, they tend to asymmetrically extend the scope of the demonstrative pronoun to contexts in which a personal pronoun would be more appropriate, but not the other way around. So for the demonstrative pronoun, we see increasing variation for the bilinguals in the sense that they go for both for the interpretation where there refers to the non-subject antecedent, but also for the interpretation where it refers to the subject antecedent. For the personal pronoun, we don't see that. Both the bilingual and the monolinguals go for the preferred interpretation is that the antecedent for the personal pronoun is the subject antecedent. So again, we see an asymmetry. We see asymmetric effects. So why do we see asymmetric effects? And I'll restrict my discussion to pronouns to null subject languages rather than Germanic languages, but we can come back to Germanic languages if you want later. So the first account that is natural to take into consideration is the transfer account. And that's indeed what we did in the early studies, because in many of the early studies, the data that we collected were from bilingual Italian speakers with English as the other language. And that applies both to second language acquisition, so Italians, native speakers of Italian with English as a second language, but also native speakers of English with Italian as the second language. And so if English is the other language, both the first or the second, then we can expect perhaps transfer effects, the fact that English is not a null subject language, and so the overextension of the overt form might be justified in terms of transfer effects. Not completely, the form is not completely acquired in L2, and it's lost, so to speak, in attrition. This can't be the whole story, we discovered subsequently, because research has shown that this overuse of overt pronouns is attested in bilingual speakers who speak two pro-drop languages, two null subject languages of the same type. And this is not an exhaustive list. One of the most recent studies where we found this was a study of Italian Sardinian speakers, two null subject languages, learned in the early stages of life rather than as adults. But there is plenty of evidence from bilingual speakers of two null subject languages, where apparently, there's no reason to overextend the overt pronoun because the other language doesn't behave in this way. Interestingly, in Germanic languages, remember, the overextension of demonstratives has also been found in bilingual speakers of Germanic or Scandinavian languages as well, that behave in similar ways. They have the same choice of overt pronominal forms. And these are demonstratives overgeneralized in bilingual speakers of the languages that both have the same choice of overt pronominal forms. And so again, the transfer effects it comes into question. So the second explanation, which is not an alternative explanation in the sense that it's not either this explanation or the transfer explanation, but it could be an additional interpretation of these facts in addition to the transfer that shouldn't be excluded, is bilingualism itself. So according to this tack that we are exploring, it's not that, so for example, or indeed acquisition. So these results don't have to do with processing, with grammar being affected, but with how the grammar is accessed, how these forms are processed in real time. So these bilingual speakers have a grammar, obviously, that makes available a choice of pronominal forms. But how the pronominal forms are chosen and used in particular contexts depends on interface conditions that have to be handled by speakers, and that are affected not only by linguistic knowledge, by having a grammar that makes the choices available, but also by language processing issues and general cognitive factors. So this is the integration of grammatical and pragmatic contextual information in real time, as I mentioned at the very beginning, right? These contingencies that Colin Phillips is talking about, requiring the integration of multiple factors. This is what I'm aiming at. So if we consider this integration of grammatical and pragmatic information in real time, what we are assuming is that the grammar itself is not affected. What is affected in bilingualism and what it may be at the source of these phenomena that I've just described is actually the handling these interface conditions by particular bilingual or monolingual speakers. So in using anaphoric forms, pronouns, for example, which aspects of cognitive control cognitive control are involved. So speakers have to be able to clearly, if they go for one pronominal assignment, they have to inhibit the other. So in the sentences where they had a choice between going for one type of linking or the other, if they go for one, they can't go for the other, so they have to inhibit the other. But more crucially, they have to integrate changing information from the context. And that involves assessing the plausibility and the appropriateness of dropping a pronoun, for example, because you drop a pronoun when it's clear what you're referring to, when it's clear who the referent, or what the referent of the null pronoun is. And that has to be clear not only to the speaker, but also to the listener. So there is a certain amount of an assessment of the situation, the context, but also the interlocutor's knowledge state. And that involves, going for one type of pronominal choice or the other, depending on this assessment, but also being able to change, to move, from one pronoun to the other. And that involves updating the discourse model when required by the context and disengaging inhibition. I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean by this. If this is involved in handling the choice of pronominal forms in real time, a straightforward hypothesis of why we see the phenomena that I mentioned at the beginning is that maybe the cognitive resources that are necessary for this are not always sufficient, but for bilingual speakers. They're not always sufficient for these kind of tasks. So remember that bilingual speakers don't always overgeneralize and overpronoun. They vary. So there is increasing variability. Sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't. When they don't, they seem to overuse the overpronoun or interpret the overpronoun in a particular way. So overextending the of the overpronoun. So one easy and probably not very interesting hypothesis is that the cognitive resources are not always available because there is competition for resources that have to be employed for other means, for other aims. So for example, for keeping the two languages separate. We know from plenty of research on the cognition of bilingualism that all languages are simultaneously active in bilinguals and multilinguals. When they use one, they have to exclude or inhibit the others to different extents, depending on the context, depending on the bilingual experience, depending on the bilingual community, depending on the interlocutor. But basically, given that all languages are activated at the same time, this inhibition is more or less required in actual language use. So it may be, there is competition of resources, and the cognitive resources necessary to do this appropriate choice of pronominal forms are not always there. Now, there are some facts about the results that I mentioned before that seem to be consistent with this tack, with this interpretation. So, as I said, we find a convergence between attrition and acquisition. So between attriters, native attrited speakers, and advanced non-native speakers of the same language. But the size of the effect is different. So this overextension of the verb pronoun tends to be smaller for attrited speakers than for non-native speakers. And if we take this kind of first interpretation, it might be that in second language speakers, the unwanted language, the language that they have to exclude, is still, they are still one which might need more resources to be inhibited, as opposed to the attrited speakers, where the unwanted language to be excluded is their less dominant L2, which may need fewer resources to be inhibited. This is clearly open to discussion. What does it mean, dominant, less dominant, and so on and so forth, and so on. For a native speaker of Italian like myself, for example, it's questionable whether, my Italian is always dominant, given that I use English most of the time. So there is a lot to be discussed about this, but we do see a difference in magnitude in the effect, although we see a convergence, the same effect, the same overgeneralization of the avere pronoun. Another hypothesis that I'd like to present, and this is really work in progress, is the fact that what we see, it might be, let's remember that, first of all, it's not random use of pronouns that we see, but the overgeneralization of one of the forms, the avere pronoun. So what if this integration of contextual information and choice of pronominal forms, and maybe updating, because the situation changes, what was salient, 2 minutes ago may not be salient anymore. So you have to switch from using a null pronoun to using an avere pronoun, or to repeating a noun phrase, which is another obvious way of clarifying what the attachment is and what you mean, who you're or what you're referring to. What if this integration of contextual cues and updating is not always optimal for particular reasons? So one possibility is that there is a trade-off between ability to inhibit and ability to integrate. So this is a trade-off that has been well attested in cognitive psychology in various typical and atypical populations. But there is a trade-off in the sense that the better you are in general, the better you are, the stronger the inhibition that you apply, the harder, the more demanding updating and integrating information might become. So that's what a trade-off means. And so integration of contextual information in part requires the ability to rapidly recover from inhibition, particularly when changes in natural communication are clearly unpredictable. You can't predict how a conversation will evolve. And so, what we are saying is this. So if you're a bilingual, the bilingual experience might actually confer advantages, and this is attested, in terms of inhibitory control. So particularly if you're a late bilingual, somebody who has acquired the language as an adult, you become potentially very good at inhibition, at inhibitory control, because your native language is very dominant, particularly at the beginning. You have to apply a lot of inhibition to it when you are really acquiring the second language. Then, this need to inhibit the first language might diminish, particularly if you are fully immersed in the second language community and so on. But this experience might actually confer advantages in terms of inhibitory control that might come with potential disadvantages in building what we can call building central coherence and integrating non-linguistic cues, and particularly refocusing attention when it's necessary, to switch, for example, from dropping a pronoun to using avere pronoun, or vice versa. So we did a study not on language, on non-linguistic phenomena involving negative priming, which is precisely what I'm talking about. If you're very good at inhibition, you find it more difficult to switch and to integrate information, to respond to the need to integrate information. And one example that I wanted to give priming, what I mean by negative priming is the classic Stroop paradigm, where the classic Stroop paradigm is what you see in list A. So this is a classic task where you have to name the color of the ink in which the words are written. So, if you look at list A, the first word is a blue word. So you have to say blue because the ink is blue, but the word says red. And so that clashes, you can't help reading what the word says, but you have to say blue, but you read red, and that slows you down. There is an interfering effect because you can't help reading what the word says. Similarly, you have to say purple to the second word, but the word says yellow, so there is a clash. What I mean by negative priming is the list B. So you have to do the same thing. So you have to name the color of the ink. So you have to say green to the first word. The word says blue. Okay, same clash that I was talking about. You're right. But look at the second word. Now you have to say blue, which is exactly the color that you've just inhibited in the previous trial. So you are even more delayed in this list B than in the previous one, because what you have to name is the color that you've just inhibited. So you have to recover from inhibition. You have to, release inhibition, if you want, in order to name the color appropriately. Similarly, you have to say the third word, you have to say red, but, if previously you had to inhibit red, then you're slowed down even more because you have to recover from the inhibition that you've just applied. So basically much research, both in cognitive psychology, but also I think it's interesting to apply this in linguistic research, focusing on these post-conflict effects. So the ability to update, this task set in a situation of unpredictable communication and so on. So disengaging attention from previously attended information, refocusing in a flexible way when it's required. This is what I mean, focusing on post-conflict effects. So what I'm suggesting is that we may see this, in terms of pronominal use. What happens, when bilingual speakers are not able to, recover from inhibition and adjust the choice of pronouns in an appropriate way, in a way that it's appropriate to the context, what happens is that they stick in a pronoun. So they don't use pronouns randomly, they stick in a pronoun, which is very interesting. Why do they go in the direction of overgeneralizing the overt form? So first of all, bilinguals are not all the same, as I said before, depending on the type of bilingual experience. Bilinguals may be better at switching from one language to the other, and from one type of pronoun to the other. They may exhibit more efficient non-linguistic inhibition. They may be better able to refocus attention and disengage inhibition and refocus attention, depending on the type of bilinguals, if they are early bilinguals or if they live in a bilingual environment where switching from one language to the other is common, as opposed to, early bilinguals, that's what I've just said, as opposed to adult bilinguals, where, as we said, you have to develop very good inhibitory control because of a dominant language that you were born and raised with, and that could have an effect on non-linguistic cognitive control, which in turn affects the use of particular structures like the interface structures, the pronominal use that I've just mentioned. So late bilinguals may be less consistent in terms of integration, updating. When they can't do it, so sometimes they do it, when they can't do it, they stick in a pronoun. So first of all, we see an adaptive cognitive control system, and this is very much at the center of discussion in cognitive psychology. So cognitive control is not just one for all, but is shaped in different ways by different types of bilingual experience. And this is what, you know, we may see if we look at different kinds of bilingual groups, different ages of first exposure to the second language, and so on. But also, the working hypothesis is that the changes that we see in the first language might be functional to the second language attainment. This is all very, very open. So the fact that we see this convergence in highly proficient bilinguals might suggest that this is actually functional, that the selective changes, so for example, changes in the type of pronominal use that we see in atriters and in second language learners, actually this convergence might be functional to second language acquisition. We can't really say this at the moment because what we are comparing is two different populations on the same language. What we need to do is to see what happens within the same learners. Obviously, if there is a convergence between their different languages. And so that implies, not looking necessarily at the same phenomena, but looking at different phenomena and looking at potential convergences between first language changes and second language attainment. The last thing that I wanted to say, and to finish, why do we see the overextension of the overt subject? That might be related to another aspect of bilingualism that has been studied at length, and that is empathy, so the ability to see the other person's perspective. So using the overt pronoun means reducing the risk of ambiguity. Because if you drop a pronoun when it's not clear what you're talking about, obviously the result is ambiguity. If you use an overt pronoun when it's not appropriate, yes, you may introduce some unclarity, but in most cases, the result is redundancy. So redundancy rather than ambiguity, that might be the direction that bilinguals go into because of their sensitivity to the risk of ambiguity, their sensitivity to creating ambiguity for the other speaker. So this is, again, another very open question. So to conclude, selectivity of first language attrition revisited, and gradients, we looked at a gradient phenomena, we looked at a convergence with respect to this gradient phenomena between atriters on the one hand and second language, advanced second language learners of the same language. The interpretation that we're giving at the moment is that attrition in late bilingualism, in adult late bilingualism, affects only aspects of processing, not the grammar itself. In fact, it's reversible. So, I think I had other slides there that didn't show up for some reason. You can have them when the slides will be shared. So these phenomena of attrition are reversible by re-exposure, full re-immersion in the original community. That again suggests that, it's not a permanent change in the grammar. It's something that has to do with how the grammar is accessed and how, the choice of pronominal forms depends on an assessment of the context. So there is a drop in input and increasing second language input, and then, changes in processing and access to the first language, fewer opportunities to use the L1, and selective effects on processing, on grammatical processing, rather than grammar itself. This is in first generation atriters, bear in mind. So in people who were born and raised in their original community, and then, for example, moved to a second language community. I'm not talking about the next generation. I'm not talking about heritage speakers. So the children of these first generation speakers, because at that point, remember that, these children, the next generation, heritage children, get input from attrited parents. And this link is very important and understudied, because clearly, they get exposed to more variation. If they hear the language in sufficient amounts, these heritage speakers might actually regularize, incorporate the variation into their grammar. And at that point, we can start looking at changes in the grammar, in the language itself. And that is one of the gates into diachronic change. Not the only reason, but one of the factors that might lead to diachronic change. So we should really look more at the connection between individual attrition in first generation speakers and what happens to the next generation. And messages for society: languages influence each other in all bilinguals. This is a normal, a predictable process, but also a selective process. We didn't see effects in all aspects of grammar. It tends to affect interface structures, so structures that interface with particular kinds of conditions that affect them and create orderly gradients, if you want. So we had a look at, a couple of these conditions. We need much more research to look at different kinds of interfaces, different kinds of structures, whether they're affected to the same extent. And these changes and adaptations might be necessary for good, advanced second language development. We put that forward as a hypothesis. And the convergence effects may be visible to different extents, depending on the type of bilingual experience. But the message for society is that we shouldn't expect bilinguals to behave like monolinguals in L1 and monolinguals in L2, which is what, unfortunately, we tend to do. We compare bilinguals with monolinguals in research, but in society, we test bilinguals on the basis of, very often on the basis of tests developed on monolingual norms. So, the open question that I like to raise is, where is the monolingual speaker? If we accept that, your grammar can change as a result of exposure and learning of another language, well, where are the real complete monolinguals? And is it appropriate to compare what bilinguals do with monolinguals, rather than, as we try to do more and more, compare more people who are more bilingual to people who are less bilingual. So bilingualism as a continuum rather than as a dichotomous choice. So let's stop with the native monolingual norm applied in second language acquisition, in second language teaching as well. The aim is to speak like a native speaker, to sound like a native speaker, to behave like a native speaker. And the advantages and disadvantages in psychology, but also in other fields, are defined in terms of the native monolingual norm. So let's actually discontinue this practice on the basis of the data that we see. And in order to do that, we need interdisciplinary research. We need bridges between languages and other cognitive domains, and also, I would say, among different subfields of research on language. So, we like to specialize, and it's very useful to specialize, particularly for younger researchers, to specialize on attrition, for example, to specialize on second language acquisition, or to specialize on, child bilingualism. But ultimately, we have to be able to pull together different strands of research and different insights from different fields in order to understand what we do better, and in order to build bridges between research and society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonella, for this fascinating talk with lots of paths actually opening. So it's time for questions.